Assessment, Lesson 6. When I've talked with other instructors about using CI storytelling, one of the biggest questions I get is about assessment. How do I assess learner proficiency in a CI storytelling setting? I think it helps to talk about what makes a good assessment in the first place. I use the following criteria to figure out what makes a good assessment. It has to assess something specific. Let's say that I'm teaching a Spanish class and I want to assess how well a learner knows the expressions with tener. That could be a good example. It must assess learner proficiency. There are lots of ways to assess learners that don't assess proficiency, and I think that's a waste of time. It needs to be easy to grade. And this sounds like me being lazy, but it's not. If I have 100 students and it takes me 10 minutes to grade each student's work, that's way too much time wasted on assessment. Assessment does not equal proficiency. It's just a snapshot of where they're at right now, and I need to be able to grade this quickly and move on. In the past, I used to add a lot of feedback to learners' work. This was a waste of time too, as most students didn't even bother to look at the feedback I gave them. An ideal assessment for me also includes rubric-based grading. This makes things very clear for the learner, and it makes things very clear for me what grade an assignment will get. And I should be able to get similar results across different student populations. Let's say that I use the same assessment in different classes. In the same way, we should be able to get similar results if I use the same assessment in the same level in different quarters. When I'm assessing, I break things down into two categories: formative assignments and summative assessments. You might call them formative assessments versus summative assessments. I prefer formative assignments. And these build proficiency. They're easy to complete. They happen all the time. And they're super easy to assess. So they're easy for the students, but they're also super easy for me to assess. Summative assessments happen after the fact, and they assess proficiency. With summative assessments, there is a range of difficulties. They happen less often, and again, they happen after the fact. Also, they need to be easy to assess. I need to be able to grade them quickly and efficiently. The traditional grammar assessment still has a place in many CI storytellers' classrooms, and I recommend to you that you do not abandon ship with that just yet. Creating assessments is a ton of work. And I mean a ton of work. So don't abandon what you already have just yet. But be aware that the traditional grammar assessments will not work very well with storytelling. As soon as you feel comfortable creating new assessments, then you can start to phase out these traditional grammar tests. For storytelling, there are various assessments we can use, and let's look at some of them. Now, the first thing that I want to point out is that a rubric is very helpful for grading these assessments, and it makes you grade much faster. So if you're not using a rubric for grading most things, you better start, because that is the fastest way to grade stuff and to be consistent and fair in your grading. My basic rubric is as follows. It's 2-1-0. It's not geared for precision. It's geared for a very general grade to assign a student for a specific task. So a 2 would be you did it easily. 1, you completed the task successfully, but you struggled your way through. And 0, you didn't attempt the exercise. For example, if the student wasn't in class, that might be why they get a 0. Everyone else will probably be getting 1s and 2s. These are the kinds of assessments we can use for CI storytelling: interpersonal communication, a comprehension quiz, a TPR quiz, a timed write, an I can assessment, and an oral story retell. With these assessments in hand, you're going to be able to assess learner proficiency quickly and efficiently, and in a variety of ways. Let's take a look at interpersonal communication. This is a daily grade for me, and it's graded 2-1-0. A 2 would be that you were there and you actively participated for the whole class period. A 1, you were there, but maybe you didn't participate the whole class period, but you still made an effort to speak Spanish when you were participating, or whatever L2 might be. A 0 would be that you weren't present in class or used L1 in class. Now, a system that I use to make this easier to grade for me is updating this grade weekly. I update it once per week. So depending on the week, the point total will vary. If I have 4 days in the class, the point total for this grade will only be 8 points. If I have 5 days, it'll be 10 points. If I only have 2 days, it'll be 4 points, etc. By updating only once a week, it saves me the time of data entry. I highly recommend condensing this into one grade, even though you keep track of it daily. And how do I keep track of it? It's very simple. I just have my attendance sheet and I make a dot on every student. And if they earn a 1, I'll write a 1 by their name. If they earn a 0, I'll put a 0 by their name. If they're absent, I'll put an A by their name. It's a very simple system to keep track, and at the end of the week, all I have to do is add up the points and put them in the gradebook. It's very fast, and it's a great way to hand out interpersonal communication points. Comprehension quiz. There's lots of ways to do a comprehension quiz, and I like to do listening and reading comprehension quizzes. These can be true or false, multiple choice, fill in the blank, complete the sentence. Some way of assessing that learners have comprehended the material. They've comprehended the language that we've been targeting in class. This is very straightforward, and you can do one of these per story. You can do 2 of them per story. It's really up to you how often you want to do these. Some people do them every class period, and that might be a little excessive. It's possible to do just that. TPR quiz. Now, a TPR quiz is pretty cool because over the course of a story and over the course of several stories, we've built up some vocabulary and some TPR gestures that go with that vocabulary. So here's an example. I've got my dice and a gesture that goes with that. Dice. This is a quiz on learners' knowledge of key vocabulary. And we can do it once a week, or we can do it after several stories when we've built up some more vocabulary. And the way that this works is that you do a gesture, and the student responds to you in L2. So if I do a gesture for dice, the student, all they have to do to get the grade is say dice. Now here's an example list of some Spanish vocabulary that we've built up over the course of several stories, and this is TPR vocabulary. From this list, I will do 2 gestures. All they have to do to earn their grade is to tell me the word or phrase in Spanish. I did 2 gestures and you told me both of the words, that's a 2. I did 2 gestures and you told me one of the words, that's a 1. And if you weren't able to tell me any, that's a 0. You can make this even easier for learners by adding a 3rd gesture and giving them a score out of 2 still. So they get 3 chances to get 2 right. A timed right is another awesome assessment idea. I love this idea. I use it all the time in my classes. So here's how I grade mine, and you can grade it in a slightly different way. You can modify this rubric, but this is a great way to do it. I want a little more precision with this rubric. I don't want just a 2, 1, 0. So I've added a little more precision. A 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. I find that this matches up nicely with our grading system, since it's a 4-point system, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. And I grade largely on word count. So at the beginning, we aim for 50 plus words in L2 on topic and using the vocabulary from class. And as they go down in the number of words that they get a lower score. Also, their score would be lowered if they were off topic or if they were using vocabulary that was not from class. I'm not trying to assess that vocabulary knowledge. I want to assess the vocabulary knowledge from stuff we've covered in class. So I set a timer for 5 to 10 minutes, and during that time, the learners write. I typically set it for 5, but you can extend that to 10 if you want to. Learners write continuously. They don't stop writing for the whole time that the timer is going. You just keep writing. And that's what I tell them. Just keep writing. You're graded mostly on word count. Get as many words as you can. Sometimes I give them a topic. Sometimes it's a story summary, a written version of the story that we've co-created as a class and that we've read versions of and that we've talked about the vocabulary ad nauseum. Or it could be a free write. And again, I tell them it's largely graded on word count. The goal is to write as much as you can, to produce as much as you can in the time allotted. Now, the reason for the timer is very important, and it's this. Work expands as to fill the time available for its completion. So the more time you give learners, the longer it's going to take them. When you reduce the amount of time and compress their time frame, they're still able to produce a lot, and sometimes they even produce more because they know that they're timed. Another form of assessment is the I can assessment. Learners receive a prompt with specific I can language, and they record a video response to their prompt. Again, using that Parkinson's law of compressing a time frame, I give them 20 to 30 minutes to read the prompt, come up with a response, record, and submit their video. And I use the 2-1 grading system for this. A 2 would be you nailed it. It was easy for you. You responded with confidence, accuracy, not a lot of pauses. A 1 would be you completed it, but you struggled your way through. You hesitated some. You had some confidence problems that affected communication. Or maybe there was enough inaccurate language that it was hard for me to understand. And a 0 would simply be that you didn't complete the assignment, or you used Google Translate or didn't do your own work. You read your response. Maybe you didn't submit the assignment on time, or there was no video. So those are some other things that could give a learner a 0. These I can statements need to be specific. So, for example, I can say 2 things I like to eat for a midnight snack. I can say 1 food I try to avoid after midnight and why that is. These are 2 very specific items I want learners to be able to express based on, let's say, a story that we told together. By narrowing the focus so much, it becomes a task that learners can complete, and they can point to and say, hey, I can say these specific things. And over time, the amount of specific things that these learners can express grows and grows. The last kind of assessment I use in my storytelling classes is an oral story retell. What is an oral story retell? Well, simply, learners retell me a story using only the target language. What are the components of an oral story test? Well, learners retell a story in L2. It could be a story that we co-created in class. It could be a story that learners read and discussed in class. So maybe I provided a parallel version of a story for learners to read and discuss, and that's the story we use for the test. Or it could be a story that I've assigned learners to read independently. I tend to lean towards the first option, but any of these 3 would be perfectly valid, and I've done all 3 in the past decade of teaching with storytelling. Something you need to decide is who selects the story. If it's the students, make sure you give them a list of options to choose from. That way you are in ultimate control of what story gets retold. Is it in groups or is it solo? If you have them in groups, make sure that they read the same story. If it's a solo retell, having them select the story and giving them more freedom there is a good idea. Is it in front of the class or in private? I lean towards in private. Having them in front of the class will just raise their affective filter. Although that's something you need to decide. Do you want to see them perform with that affective filter raised? I recommend against having them perform with their affective filter raised because you won't get their best results. They do better when there's less pressure. Picture notes. I allow them to use picture notes like the ones here. They can draw as many drawings as they want to, use as many pieces of paper as they want to. These drawings may represent words, they may represent events in the story. This is like TPR, where learners are making another association with the language and the pictures that they've drawn by hand. This ties the story to memory, and when they come for their retell, they don't have to remember word for word what happened in the story. Instead, their memory has been outsourced to the page, and they look at the pictures, and these pictures help them recall L2. I require that students make these pictures because it's a built-in way to study for this assessment. And furthermore, the act of drawing out the story really ties it to deep memory and allows for easy recall. It's graded by 3 main factors: communication and flow, grammar and vocabulary, natural progression of fluency. This rubric is on our lesson if you want to read it in more detail, but I break it down into 4 groups plus a 0. So 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. You don't want to use all of these different assessments at the same time. In fact, I recommend using 2 or 3 at the most assessments per story that you tell. 2 is probably much safer: a timed write and a listening quiz, a written comprehension quiz, and a I can assessment. Poco a poco se va lejos. Slow and steady wins the race. Just a few assessments go a long way towards assessing proficiency.